What is going on, Diablo 2 fans? Dobrunsky here. In today's video, I'm going to play dev for a little bit. So with community manager Adam Fletcher pretty much confirming that we should be expecting PTR for patch 2.5 somewhere between mid to late August, and then assuming probably an announcement shortly before that, we're pretty much right on the cusp of some new content for D2, or at least hoping. So I thought it'd be cool to make a Let's Be a Dev video, and I'm going to cover 10 skills that I think need a bit of a rework. So everything ranging from almost a total revamp to just tweaking a little bit to make them more viable. And again, if you paid attention to the thumbnail of this video, and thank you for clicking on this video, by the way, I should say that more often. Thank you for checking out my channel. You probably already have an idea of what a lot of these skills are going to be, but I genuinely think that a lot of them could be just slightly tweaked or changed to actually be useful and maybe open up some new builds. So in avenues, or excuse me, in terms of like new room words opening up new build avenues, I think that some of these skill tweaks will again also open up some new avenues for some different characters, which is ultimately what I would really like to see instead of just everything being Jabazons, Blizzard Sorceresses, Hammertons, etc. Some new, more viable builds and tweaks would be pretty cool. So hopefully you guys enjoy this video. Again, let me know in the comment section below if you guys agree or disagree. Any good, healthy discussion is good, and you can maybe give some feedback that the devs might catch in this video. Other than that, guys, hope you enjoyed this video. And again, a quick reminder before we jump in, just want to let you guys know that I do stream twice a week on Twitch. Got the link for my Twitch channel in the description below. Any follows on that platform would be very much appreciated. That being said, guys, let's jump in. So the first skill that I want to cover, and again, these are in no particular order, but it is Hunger for the Shapeshifting Druid. Now, I do want to point out that I got this idea from Macro. I'm going to have his channel and his video linked in the description below. But he had a really cool idea of transforming this skill to actually make it useful, because as it currently stands, it has a negative 75% damage penalty and has a large attack rating and life and mana steal attached to it. But the skill itself is really, for the most part, useless, considering any form of life leech and mana leech with high damage is completely fine. And then in addition to that, if you have a fully charged Feral Rage, you're also getting additional life leech for Shapeshifting Druid as well. So something like the Reaper's Toll setup with a dual leech ring and string of ears, you already have a ton of life leech. Compound that with Feral Rage, I just don't see the point of this skill. And I do kind of get the mindset of the original developers. They were kind of thinking, well, you could maybe alternate back and forth between Feral Rage, throw in Hunger to replenish your mana and life, and then go back to Fury. But with kind of the min-maxing and sort of as time developed, it's a useless skill for Shapeshifting Druid. So his idea was very cool, giving it a flat 100% base damage increase, and then also making it an uninterruptible and an attack that always hits. So it's kind of like a smiter, but for Shapeshifting Druids. Now, I think this is really cool, because imagine just the start of a ladder, everyone is always like a budget Paladin. That's because Smite always hits, you stack some form of Crushing Blow and Life Tap, you're good to go. Well, what about shapeshifting into a bear or a wolf, having a ton of extra plus life? You don't have the aura support, but you kind of supplement with a lot of plus life, and then just smacking Ubers with Hunger, having it do a decent amount of damage, not be interrupted, and then always hit. So you could get a Life Tap proc from a wand or something, and then just use Hunger, and then use that as a budget character to take down Ubers. So I think that's a really cool idea and a good approach to make Hunger a little bit more viable, and it's something that I would actually really like to see adjusted, because as it currently stands, this is probably the most least used skill for the Shapeshifting Druid. It pretty much earns that title, so I definitely would like to see Hunger reworked in some way, and I think that's a really good starting point. So carrying on with the theme of the Druid, I would really like to see Spirit of the Barbs reworked. Oak Sage is such a powerful skill at level 6, a ton of plus life. Heart of the Wolverine, a lot of attack rating and damage, really good for shapeshifters. But this reflection of damage, you can see here, level 25 reflects 509 damage. That is so useless. I don't really think anybody ever uses this skill, and it's such a cool looking one, so it's such a shame. But I think that a good way to sort of balance between Oak Sage and Heart of the Wolverine would be adding additional life, mana, and defense for every skill point that you invest. Now, obviously, you would have to have it be tuned down a little bit to maybe half the life value of Oak Sage. So you kind of have the choice. Let's say you're playing as a Wind Druid, you want a very high life pool, or do you maybe want a large life pool and a large mana pool, but not quite as much as what Oak Sage would provide you. So it gives you kind of a little bit of play there. And again, I know a lot of people think defense is useless, but if you are tele-stomping, sitting in the same spot, slinging tornadoes, or if you're surrounded by monsters, you're attacking still with Fury or All or something, it would help shapeshifters. And the reason why I wanted to add defense as well is because the wolf has almost no defense. You might have like 2k defense with a Fury Wolf. That's pretty bad compared to the very high defense pool of a bear. And I know they were trying to distinguish between the two. Bear's unstoppable force, Wolf is kind of a more agile force, but I think a lot of people would use Spirit of the Barbs to complement Fury Druids with the lack of defense. Again, some people might just jump straight to Heart of the Wolverine, excuse me. But I think in this case, plus life and mana and defense would make Spirit of the Barbs useful instead of useless. So the third and final skill that I want to touch on for the Druid is Volcano. I want to make one thing very clear. From patch 2.3 to patch 2.4, the Fire Druid took many steps forward. So increasing the fall rate and the radius of Armageddon, removing the global cooldown associated between all the different fire skills was a fantastic change. And also Molten Boulder is great now. Increasing the velocity and the rate that you can cast it is all great positive changes for the Fire Druid. But I genuinely believe this build still struggles against fire immune monsters because most of your physical damage is coming from Molten Boulder, Volcano, and Armageddon. Armageddon is sporadic. Molten Boulder is decent, does knockback and okay damage, but Volcano is kind of, I think, the big lackluster skill for the Fire Druid, and that's largely, in my opinion, because of two flaws with the skill. The first is the next hit delay that is associated with the skill, so any damage from the center Volcano or any of the magma that's flying off of Volcano has a 1.5 second next hit delay tied to it, so if you're hit with another source of damage in that 1.5 seconds, the monster will not take any damage. So that, I think, is holding it back huge. I would like to see that, like, brought way down. Like, I don't know how low you can go with the next hit delay, but also I think that the casting delay should be at least shortened, like 50%. You don't necessarily have to go with no cooldown, but I think that when you're dealing with large groups of fire immune monsters, it would be nice if we could cast a few more Volcanoes to get some more physical damage going with Molten Boulder, and then remove that stupid next hit delay or severely reducing it so that they can actually take multiple hits of the physical damage portion of Volcano so that we can actually do some substantial damage to those fire immune monsters, because fire characters in general really struggle because of fire immunities, and I think that the devs did take a very solid approach by adding physical damage, but reducing the cooldown or removing it and removing the next hit delay on Volcano would substantially improve Fire Druid and make it a lot better character. So nothing major needs to be changed here. I think that starting with removing the next hit delay or reducing it and dropping the cooldown will, maybe a 2-second casting delay would be a big improvement for the Fire Druid. So moving on to the Necromancer, the first skill that I would like to see reworked is Raise Skeletal Mage. This was the build that I was most excited for in PTR and was the most let down. I know that they didn't want to go overboard in terms of damage, but as it currently stands with a level 45 Raised Skeletal Mage, you really can't kill anything. I purposely recorded some footage removing the weapon off the Mercenary and just relying on a very powerful Raised Skeleton Mage army with Fire Golem and lower resistance, and the rate that it takes to get a kill is honestly horrible. So I think that you really need to do just two small things to raise Skeletal Mage. That is to increase the rate of fire and increase the rate of damage. I know that it's a really difficult balancing act with how powerful Corpse Explosion is, because again, if you go back to that post-recorded footage, the mages were doing nothing, and then as soon as you get a corpse, you switch to amp damage, and then you Corpse Explode the entire room. But I just think that it would be very interesting if we could get a first kill off a little bit quicker with a raised Skeleton Mage instead of a Mercenary. So that would be kind of the small tweak that I would like to see, is just extra damage and the rate of fire, so that if you have a level 45 Mage, it can actually do some significant damage. I think that they were on the right track of adjustments to make, because they did do a pretty big damage buff. I think it was like 900% poison damage to the poison mages specifically, if I remember going way back from the PTR notes, but it just didn't actually turn out to be enough in-game damage in my opinion. So I just think that a very solid, healthy damage buff and then increasing the rate of fire would be a step forward to make a Skeleton Mage army Necro. So wrapping up the Necromancer, I definitely would also like to see Fire Golem receive a pretty decent buff. So I have a level 45 Fire Golem that's doing 1600 fire damage and has a Holy Fire pulse damage of 356. I really think that you could triple that damage and it wouldn't have a noticeable impact for the Necromancer. So it's kind of unfortunate because the Fire Golem looks so cool, but I do think that there's a couple ways we could kind of tie together Blood Golem, Fire Golem, and then Skeleton Mage to make it a high point investment army, but actually be viable. So what if they tied in synergies between Skeleton Mage, Fire Golem, and Blood Golem, where the Fire Golem and Blood Golem are giving damage bonuses to Raised Skeleton Mage. So you have to actually invest 20 art points into Skeleton Mage, 20 art points into Mastery, and then 20 into Fire Golem, and then 20 to Blood Golem. That's an 80-point build to boost the damage of Skeleton Mage. So at that point, you have less available skill points to put into other skills like Corpse Explosion and Amplified Damage. So you would still have access to those skills, but it would kind of limit the amount that you could invest into Amp Damage for Radius or Corpse Explosion for Radius damage. So I think that would be a cool way to make the Fire Golem useful in terms of synergy for Skeleton Mage, but I also think that it needs a bit of a damage buff. Like I said, you have Clay Golem that has such fantastic utility from slowdown with Decrepify, and then you have an Iron Golem which you can turn an Insight into an Iron Golem to get a constant meditation aura for your mana. So it's very difficult for me to want to use a Fire Golem that does like 356 Holy Fire damage and then 1600 fire damage over the Clay Golem or Insight Iron Golem counterparts. So I think that a very healthy damage buff, as well as tying synergies to Skeleton Mage, so you turn a Skeleton Mage Necro into an 80-point investment build, would be a couple different ways to sort of make them a little bit more viable, because I genuinely believe, as it currently stands, Clay Golem and Iron Golem are just too good to even consider using Fire Golem or Blood Golem. So this would be at least a small adjustment to make Fire Golem worth using. So moving on to the Amazon, one skill in particular that I would like to see adjusted is Immolation Arrow. Now this is probably the one skill that I have kind of the most sort of back and forth ideas on how to actually change it. I want to say first, I think that the Boazon is actually in a pretty good place. Multi-shot and strafe are much stronger than what they were in patch 2.3. Now I know a lot of people are up in arms from the PvP community, but I can say from the PvM perspective, I think that it's actually now a build that is more representative of the gear required to make it excel. So if you had crazy Charm Inventory, Ruby Jewels of Fervor, a Pride Mercenary, in patch 2.3 the damage was, in my opinion, lackluster, but I think it's in a pretty good spot now. I also think the Freezing Arrow is very powerful. You have a skill that you can spam with no cooldown that completely freezes monsters for 2 seconds at one point, or with synergies you can actually increase that value a lot higher. So you can freeze monsters in their tracks. Whereas Immolation Arrow, it's tied to a casting delay, which I don't really think there should even be a casting delay tied to it. That was actually shortened from 2.3 to 2.4. They reduced it in half. But I think that a couple of options could be applied to Immolation Arrow to make it a little bit better, because the first thing that we need to realize is that any fire damage dealing build is, in my opinion, at a bit of a disadvantage compared to other builds. Just the elements and immunities, you're at a bit of a distinct disadvantage. So I think that removing the casting delay could be a step forward. I know a lot of people will argue, well, you can switch back and forth between Immolation Arrow and Exploding Arrow, and that is very true. Exploding Arrow has no cooldown. I just think it's very weird that you can spam Freezing Arrow, but you can't spam Immolation Arrow. So potentially removing a cooldown on it, so you could just spam Immolation Arrow, and then maybe having Exploding Arrow be more single target damage, I guess, and maybe AoE effect for Immolation Arrow. But I also had kind of the idea, similar to how Berserk adds a small magic synergy to Frenzy, I thought it would maybe be interesting if Magic Arrow added a small % magic damage conversion to Immolation Arrow. So that would maybe help with immunities and sort of make a fair adjustment in comparison to Freezing Arrow. Because I just genuinely believe if you compare Freezing Arrow builds to Immolation Arrow builds, that Cold is just a lot stronger. Like the damage is about the same when you freeze the monster versus dealing with a lot of fire immunes, and you have an associated cooldown, and you have fire damage per second, which it is true that you can dual spec these, so you can have a fully synergized Immolation Arrow minus the fire damage per second, as well as Freezing Arrow, so you can kind of alternate back and forth between the two. But I think that a little bit of a small tweak to Immolation Arrow would be a pretty good start for the Fire Boa. So moving on to the Barbarian, there's only one skill that I would like to see adjusted, and that is Grim Ward. I think that despite melee being at a disadvantage, the Barbarian's skills, for the most part, are in a pretty good place. They're all useful and they serve a purpose. I'm going to touch on the end of the video about Whirlwind, because I know you guys are going to bring that up, but we'll leave that for the end of the video. But I think largely the specialization of the combat skill trees, throw has been improved, leap attack has a little bit of AoE. I think most of the skills are in a pretty good place. I definitely think some adjustments can be made to rune words in different bases and like the damage value of like Berserker Axes for bases in particular to make Breath of the Dying more appealing versus Grief. That's kind of an itemization issue, but in terms of skills, I think it's in a pretty good spot. But Grim Ward, I think, is a very cool skill. It's increasing the amount of damage taken and slowing down monsters. You can actually get a pretty high percent damage value, or additional damage value taken to monsters using this skill. It's very good in that regard, but I think the two things that are really holding it back that I personally find a little bit frustrating, the first is the flee. It's not necessarily like a breaking issue, but I do find it kind of annoying when I'm trying to whirlwind and I drop down Grim Ward and then monsters start fleeing. So I think that if they just removed that, it would make it a more powerful and useful skill. And the second small tweak that I would like to see is the ability to make Grim Ward from demons as well as the undead. Like if I'm running through the Chaos Sanctuary, there's tons of undead monsters, but it won't allow me to use Grim Ward on those types of enemies. It'd be very cool if, similar to how they tweaked Fist Heavens to damage like the undead and demons, it would be really neat if we could use Grim Ward on the undead and demons. I would use it a lot more frequently if it didn't flee, and I could cast it on every monster that I kill in Chaos Sanctuary. And I think that the slowdown and extra damage would kind of help compensate for the Barb, which I think is at a bit of a disadvantage to casters anyway. So two small tweaks I think would make Grim Ward a lot more viable and more useful for the Barbarian. So rounding out the skills, I want to mention Blades of Ice for the Assassin. This is, in my opinion, another lackluster skill. The martial arts skills in general were improved quite a bit from 2.3 to 2.4. The way that you expend charges, they're guaranteed to hit with finishing moves. I definitely think that was a solid quality of life improvement, but I think genuinely across the board, the damage is a little bit low. I did try pretty decked out setups of like Claws of Thunder and Phoenix Strike. The only thing I didn't try, I mean, we're talking Infinity Mercenary, Full Skillers, etc., Torch and Annie, very good gear. I haven't tried using Plague Claws, so lower res procs for maybe a little bit more damage, but I think out of a lot of the skills that you see here, like Dragon Talon for finishing move is fine, Dragonflight to teleport around, you can get pretty high damage with Tiger Strike, Phoenix Strike is okay. I genuinely feel like Blades of Ice is the weakest of the three, so I think that it could definitely use a little bit of love in terms of a bit of a damage buff, and I also think it would be pretty interesting if maybe the cold damage animation, maybe they stole it from Phoenix Strike, so maybe just give it that Chaos Ice Bolt damage look or something. Anything that would just sort of buff up the AoE and damage a little bit of skill. I mean, I know that the idea behind Phoenix Strike is lightning, fire, and cold, and you have your individual fire, Claws of Thunder, and Blades of Ice setups, but I think that Blades of Ice could use a little bit of love if it was going to pick any random skill to give a little bit of a buff, so some sort of damage and AoE effect would be cool, like maybe similar to the way that you can release Nova damage from Claws of Thunder. Maybe you could add Frost Nova damage from Blades of Ice, as well as the Phoenix Strike version, kind of infusing into it. The footage that you're seeing post-edited, that is using Claw that gives Frost Nova on proc, so that's not actually from the Blades of Ice skill, but something like that that would add a little bit of damage could be a cool complement. You could maybe supplement Fire Traps with Blades of Ice or something. So small tweak for the Assassin and the Martial Arts tree that I think could go quite a long ways. So moving on to the Paladin, I think that the skill Conversion could definitely use some love and would make for some interesting, unique twists on the standard Paladin. Now I do want to acknowledge that for the most part the Paladin is pretty OP. Zealot, Tesladin, Hammerdin, Bowden, the very powerful like defensive skills, Aura support, Smiters for Ubers, it is a very, very powerful character. But I think that the one skill that's lacking a little bit in terms of use is Conversion. I think that if they just simply increase the duration per skill level, similar to how the chance to convert increases as well, I think it would open up some pretty cool options. Like imagine sort of a Summoner Necro twist with the Paladin. You convert a big army, they're using your Fanaticism Aura, they stick around for like 3 minutes, and you have a cool army that supports your Zealot in Chaos Sanctuary. Now, the kind of, if you invest 20 hard points, it is sort of drawing away from other points that you can invest, so you'd have a little bit less defense, but you'd have an army. But I think it would be sort of a cool twist on the Paladin. I do agree that it's largely in a pretty fantastic place, but if there's one skill that I think is never used on a Paladin, it's Conversion, and it could maybe use a little bit of love to add a couple interesting kind of new tweaks to how you play the Paladin. So the final skill that I would like to see changed is Frozen Orb. Now, I actually just recently released a video where I made a Frozen Orb Sorceress with no cooldown, and the feedback from the community was very mixed. I would say about 50-50, or hell yeah, let's make that change, I want to play something other than Blizzard. And the other half of the community was like, that's too OP, don't change it like that. we need to do something else. So I want to propose a different alternative other than just flat removing the cooldown, but I genuinely believe that Frozen Orb is nothing other than an alternative for a dual spec build, but in terms of specialization, it's a pretty poor choice. And I genuinely believe that most builds past like the first month of ladder kind of move on past that dual spec and they sort of specialize, whether it's a Nova Sorceress, Lightning Sorceress, Blizzard Sorceress, maybe a Fire Sorceress or something. There's not really a lot of dual spec builds. That's just kind of like to get through the game. I guess for some people that want a solo farm, that is an option, but I genuinely believe there's a far lower percentage of Frozen Orb players to Blizzard. So I want to propose a different alternative that could actually make Frozen Orb useful. So I have two ideas. The first is that maybe allow the shards from Frozen Orb to pierce. So even though there's a cooldown, once a shard hits a monster, that shard keeps traveling through and damaging more monsters. This could be an alternative to the cooldown that would sort of make it a little bit more useful and more damage, but at the same time you kind of avoid the issues of like screen spam or destroying PvP with just so many orbs just shattering everything. So I thought that would be a really cool option. Every shard pierces through monsters. Now the other idea that I had, and this is sort of a tie-on to what the devs did, they added synergies between Frozen Armor, Shiver Armor, and Chilling Armor. And the whole purpose behind these additional synergies was to try and incentivize players to do something other than putting one hard point into Frozen Armor. But guess what happened? Every single sorceress, for the most part, 99%, continue to put 1 point into Frozen Armor. So what if you added damage synergies from Frozen Armor, Shiver Armor, Chilling Armor to Frozen Orb? So maybe you reduce the 2% from Ice Bolt and you make it 1%, and then you added 1% from Frozen Armor, 1% from Shiver Armor, 1% from Chilling Armor. So this would effectively still keep dual spec build options unchanged. You would put 20 hard points into Frozen Orb, your Cold Mastery, and then you would invest into Meteor, Fireball, or whatever you want to use for your dual spec. That would completely leave that option alone. But then if you wanted to fully invest in a Frozen Orb, you could put 20 hard points in a Frozen Orb, your Cold Mastery, 20 hard points in Ice Bolt, Frozen Armor, Shiver Armor, and Chilling Armor. So this would buff the damage of Frozen Orb, would turn it into a high point investment build similar to Blizzard. So you have a different option. You can go Blizzard or you can go Frozen Orb. The damage would be higher, but you wouldn't have the screen clutter of no cooldown. And it would also maybe incentivize players to maybe use Chilling Armor because they're going to have 20, 40, 60 points into these different armors. So you might see something other than Frozen Armor being used. So I think that would be a good alternative to sort of balance between people that want to play like a high-end powerful Frozen Orb build, but at the same time it's not going to impact PvP or make massive screen clutter. So I think additional damage synergies from the armors, as well as allowing the shards to pierce, could make Frozen Orb an alternative to Blizzard, and I think it would definitely be better for the overall like build diversity of the Sorceress. So that wraps up 10 skills that I would personally like to see change for patch 2.5. That's kind of my priority list, but I do have 4 other skills that I think could use some love as well. So I'm going to kind of flip the script. I'm going to mention these 4 skills and say like what I think I would kind of tweak, but I want to hear your feedback specifically on these 4 skills. So the first one is Poison Explosion for the Necro. I just genuinely think it's a useless skill compared to Corpse Explosion. How are we going to balance that out? Maybe massively increasing the radius of the poison effect, maybe massively increasing the damage. You definitely need to do something because Corpse Explosion just trumps that skill so much. The second skill is Blood Golem. I did mention a way of tying in synergies to make the Skeletal Mage relevant by using Blood Golem and Fire Golem, but how would you guys specifically tweak Blood Golem to make it worth using over the very powerful Clay Golem or Insight Iron Golem? I'm interested to hear you guys' feedback. The next skill is Thunderstorm. I think that the changes to synergies with Nova and Lightning Mastery and how Thunderstorm and how they kind of all interact with each other, I think that's a very solid change. But I think that the frequency of striking could definitely be upped, and that's personally a tweak that I think I would like to see, but just let me know your guys' thoughts. The final skill here, the major one, is Whirlwind. This is one that I've gone back and forth. I listened to feedback. I've read forum posts talking about frames and how things were tweaked. I still stand on the fence that I think the IS changes were a large improvement, but I think that they could make some tweaks to the IS breakpoints so that you could still hit 4 frames on two-handed Whirlwind options, as well as maybe a little bit of a damage incentive so that people would use a two-handed Breath of the Dying versus two-handed Grief. I think that in terms of quality of life and not having that stupid like normal attack interruption and just quick cast, Whirlwind is in a really good place, but I think a small tweak to two-handed weapons would make it better, but I think that's a better choice than reverting, but let me know what you guys think. That's kind of the end of the 4 skills I want to get your feedback on. So again, guys, this was a very long video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Again, more feedback in the discussion below is great, as long as you're not a dick. Other than that, guys, hope you enjoyed the video. Feel free to let me know if you think I missed anything major or if you would tweak something differently. Again, healthy discussion is always good. Other than that, guys, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you on my next video or live stream. Peace out.